Hello, and welcome to another Cuz Bad Guys breakdown. In this breakdown, we are going to go over objectives for the Batman Miniatures game. As you can see, I have all these different objectives, and we are going to cover each of them, what they do in the game, and how many points you get, where they get deployed, what different crews can take which ones, all of those different things. I've worked on getting all of these painted over the last 2 days, and I'm really happy with how a lot of them have come out. Let's go ahead and get right on into how setup works. So for this setup, I'm going to go ahead and use Skirmish, which is just a 20 centimeter deployment area for your opponent. Here we've got a street scene. I'm going to just be using this to set up objectives and show you guys how it works out on the tabletop. Just a building, some lampposts, some sewers, some cars, a wall, some pretty standard stuff that you'll find in the Batman Miniatures game, and we'll get right on into objectives. So right off the bat, let's go over controlling objectives in the Batman Miniatures game. So essentially, at the end of the turn, your model has to be in base with an objective to be able to control it. It also cannot be based by an enemy model, or the objective cannot be based by an enemy model. That is being contested. It's also important to note that a KO'd character can never control an objective as well. So let's go ahead and do a visual aid for showing how to capture an objective. So this is the Flash. He is in base with an ammo objective. And if this was the end of the turn, he would capture that. But if Zoom were to come over and base him, that is contested. If Zoom came over and touched the objective, that is also contested. And then my favorite, doing both. So he is doubly contested. So the first objective that we're going to go over is going to be loot. Loot awards 1 victory point to the player who controls it. Loot markers can be deployed up to 20 centimeters away from the enemy deployment zone on neutral ground. Loot can be carried by a character. To pick up a loot, a character must manipulate the objective marker. If a character wishes to move while carrying loot, he must spend 1 special counter. Characters may drop the loot anytime, and loot markers may be stolen like weapons with the appropriate special rules. So let's go ahead and do a visual aid for this as well. So this is the edge of the table. So in the deployment zone, 20 centimeters would be the deployment zone, and then up to 40 is where it can be. Remember, objectives have to be 5 centimeters away from other markers, which are lampposts and sewers. Let's go ahead and do a visual representation of picking up a loot. So the loot counter is on the ground. The Flash moves up to it during his activation. He'll base it. He will spend a movement counter and be able to pick up the loot, removing it from the table and putting it on his character card, and now he is carrying the loot. If he wishes to move afterwards, during a different activation, he must first spend a movement to be able to move holding the loot counter. He can then move during his activation. The next objective that we will cover will be riddles. Riddle markers are always taken in pairs. If a player chooses a riddle as one of his objectives, he therefore takes 2 markers rather than 1. Riddle markers can be deployed up to 20 centimeters away from the enemy deployment zone on neutral ground. A character may attempt to solve the riddle once per round. To attempt to solve a riddle, a character must be in base with the marker and must manipulate it, rolling a d6 on the table below. If an enemy character tries to solve this, they have a -1 penalty to their roll on the chart. After a riddle has been attempted to be solved, regardless of the roll on the chart, the riddle marker is then removed from the game. Now let's go ahead and go over the chart that you roll for the riddle. So the first one is you roll a dice, and on a 1 you're confounded, and the character that rolled for it their side gets -1 victory point. On a 2 or 3 is a failure and no victory points are awarded. On a 4 or a 5, you solve it and you figure out the solution and are awarded 1 victory point. On a roll of a 6, it is an inspired solve, and you end up getting 3 victory points for solving the riddle. Now let's go ahead and do a visual representation of placing a riddle marker. Remember, a riddle marker can be placed inside the enemy deployment zone as well as up to 20 centimeters out. So in this case, up to 40 centimeters away from the table edge. Remember, it needs to be 5 centimeters away from any other markers, which will be lampposts and sewers. Riddles are also taken in pairs, so you get 2 markers to be able to place near the enemy deployment zone. Now let's do a visual representation of solving a riddle. So if the Red Hood runs up to the riddle marker, he would need to spend 1 movement counter to manipulate it, which lets him roll a dice to see what he gets. And on a 5, you would get 1 victory point. After rolling, the riddle marker is immediately removed from the game. The next objective we're going to cover is going to be a Titan container. 2 victory points to its owner when they control it. So this is the first objective that we're covering, that an opponent cannot get victory points from controlling this objective. Once during a character's activation, a character can manipulate the Titan container to pull out a Titan dose. Let's go ahead and do a visual representation of deploying a Titan container. So here's a Titan container, and as you can see, it needs to be within 20 centimeters of the enemy deployment zone. It can be anywhere inside of the deployment zone as long as it is on the ground. Now let's do a visual representation of pulling out a Titan. So the Flash would need to move into base with the Titan container, then spend a movement counter to be able to manipulate the Titan container, and he would gain a Titan dose. Titan doses can then be used at the beginning of the character's activation to increase all of their stats. Also being in base with it at the end of the turn, he would get 2 victory points unless an enemy comes in bases the Titan container, bases the Flash, or bases both, all of which count as being contested. The next objective we'll cover is ammo crates. Ammo crates are very similar to Titan containers, but they give 3 victory points to its owner when they control it instead of 2. So this is another objective that an enemy cannot control to gain victory points. The other thing that ammo crates do is that when you manipulate them, you can refill ammo that you've spent earlier in the turn. So let's go ahead and do a visual representation of deploying ammo. So ammo would need to be placed 20 centimeters away from the enemy table edge in their deployment zone. This objective also needs to be placed on the ground and outside of 5 centimeters of any other objectives or markers. And let's do a visual representation of pulling out ammo. So if the Red Hood runs up to an ammo crate, he would need to spend a movement to manipulate it. He would then refill any ammo that he had previously spent during the turn. So he would go from 2 back up to 3. Now let's do a visual representation of getting points from an ammo container. So if the Flash is in base with the ammo container at the end of the round, he would get 3 victory points unless an enemy came and based him, based the objective, or based both. Then no one would be awarded victory points. The next objective to cover will be the safe boxes. Safe boxes award the controlling player and enemy players 1 victory point for being in base. So these are just like loot, but they cannot be picked up and moved. So when they are placed during setup, they are stuck there. And just like loot and riddles, safe boxes can be deployed up to 20 centimeters outside of an enemy's deployment zone. It's also important to note that safe boxes, because of their size, can completely block line of sight to characters if you try to shoot them. Now let's go ahead and do a visual representation of deploying a safe box. So a safe box can be inside the enemy deployment zone, and it can also be deployed up to 20 centimeters outside, so up to 40 centimeters in this case. Also, remember that a second safe box also gets deployed when choosing this objective, and they must be 5 centimeters away from other markers and other objectives. So sewers, lampposts, and other objectives. Let's go ahead and do a visual representation of getting points from a safe box. So if a safe box is placed and then the flash runs up to it, he would get points unless an enemy came and based him, or based both. That would be considered contested and would not be able to get points for the turn. The next objective to cover will be the Joker laughing gas canisters. This gives 1 victory point to its owner when they control it. You also get 2 canisters for taking this objective, and they also do damage to enemy characters when they activate within 5 centimeters of them. So if an enemy character activates within 5 centimeters of a Joker gas canister, they have to take a willpower check, and if they fail, they are immediately given 1 blood damage. So this is an objective that damages enemy characters, which is pretty great. Let's go ahead and do a visual representation of deploying a canister. So these canisters have to be deployed inside of an enemy deployment zone. They have to be 5 centimeters away from other objectives and other markers, so sewers and lampposts. So if the Red Hood activated inside of 5 centimeters of one of these canisters, he would have to take a willpower check, and he is willpower 6. So you would need to roll 2 dice and get 6 or less, but here I rolled 7, which means the Red Hood would instantly gain a blood damage. Pretty powerful objectives to have at the beginning of the game. It's important to note that only a Joker crew can take these objectives. The next objective to cover is the bat signal. I apologize about this picture. It was the only one I was able to find online. I haven't actually purchased a bat signal, so I don't have the card. But I do have a bat signal that I purchased from another store. So the bat signal gives variable points depending on whether or not it is on or not. A bat signal also has to be deployed in an enemy deployment zone, but it can be on top of a building. All other objectives must be placed on the ground floor, not on top of any scenery. So if the bat signal starts being turned off, and in its off position, it's worth 1 point to the enemy. When you turn it on, it is worth 4 points to the Batman crew. So let's go ahead and do a visual representation of deploying a bat signal. So the bat signal has to be inside an enemy deployment zone, so in this case 20 centimeters, but it can be placed on top of a building, in this case on top of the comic book store, as long as it's inside of 20 centimeters from the enemy deployment zone. Now let's go ahead and do a visual representation of turning on and off the bat signal. So in this case, the Red Hood would need to use his bat claw to be able to get on top of the comic book store in base with the bat signal. He would then spend a movement counter, manipulating the bat signal, and in this case, he would turn it on. Now, at the end of the turn, his crew would get 4 victory points. The only way to stop this is for an enemy character to do the same thing. So in this case, Nissa would use her bat claw to get on top of the comic book store, move into base. She would also spend a movement counter to manipulate it to be able to turn off the bat signal. It's important to note that the bat signal has to be on or off. Being contested, so just being in base with it, does not matter. You have to turn the bat signal on or off to get victory points. And that's it for objectives. Let's go ahead and talk about my different objectives that I have. So this objective, it's the bat signal. I actually picked this up from Barnes & Noble. It has a battery slot in it, so you can change the batteries out when it dies. It turns on. It's lasted for a long time. I've actually had this bat signal for about a year now. It's pretty sweet. So these are some of my safes. These are my Joker safes that I painted up just for the Joker crew. I really like how they turned out with the purple and the green and the ha-ha-ha's. They look super great. And the joke's still on you. That's because the first one says the joke's on you. So I thought it would be really funny just to do that, a little comedy for a crew that's all about the laughs, right? So let's move on to the other set of safes. These are blue ones, which I painted up for my law crew. I also painted them up so we can do inside of buildings and stuff so they don't look like they've been jokerized. All of them can be opened, which I'm planning on making some special missions just to play Where Is Something with 4 different safes. I really like that Night Models has made it so these can open and close. They're really simple to put together, and like I said, all of these I've made so they can all open and close. I really like the way that they're done like that. So these are going to be the Joker gas canisters. These are also from Night Models, just out of the box, painted them, put some ha-ha-ha's on them. Super easy to do, went up really fast. And here's my riddle counters. Riddle counters, just put some green on them, highlighted them, dry brushed the little boxes on the ground with some metal. They came out really good, super easy, super fast to paint. The Titan canisters, I just painted metal. I'm not sure if I want to put Titan on them or not. We'll see what I do with those. And the ammo counters. So these ammo crates, one of my buddies actually painted these. I think they look super good. Came out really well. And the last one. So here's the loot counters. So loot counters, they're just bags of money, tons of coins and gold. These, my buddy also painted these. I think these came out really, really good. I really like the way that they've come out. I'm really excited that all of these objectives have been painted now. I think that'll really help out the tabletop. So remember, cause bad guys.